how do I get my team to track their time, let alone do it accurately? That's a question that I've heard so many times from agency leaders. In one-on-one conversations, in group discussions, even in the comments section of our webinar series on agency life. It's a common question and an even more common challenge to agency life. What if I told you the answer actually lies with Simon Sinek? Start with why, as his famous mantra and best-selling book title state, right? Well, how do you actually explain the why of time tracking to your team that goes beyond the typical line of, because it's important for the business? Well, Deb Andrews, owner of Marketri, a successful marketing agency with nearly 20 years in business. Yes, I said 20. She says it all comes down to the 4 Ps that help you explain the why of time tracking that actually gets team compliance and even buy-in. In this conversation, you'll hear from her what those 4 Ps are, how they connect to one another, and how to use them to establish a culture where time tracking is seen as a valuable operational tool instead of a dreaded micromanagement reality. All right, let's dive into the conversation with Deb, where she explains a time when time tracking wasn't as easy for her team as it is today, and what she learned from that experience that's helped her create a better situation in her agency today.
So I'm 19 years into the business, and there were times when our team was relatively small and we could sort of afford to exist without policies and procedures. We didn't start time tracking till probably about 10 years into the business, and we had a couple of employees at that time were very used to not doing time tracking. So when we implemented a project management tool and started to do time tracking, it was really a culture shift for particularly one individual, and he really couldn't make that shift. It required me to kind of look at the timesheet every week and sit down with him and try to talk about the obstacles to time tracking. And what I realized in that moment is that even if you have a small team and maybe you don't necessarily need to do time tracking, establishing that policy up front before those employees are on board is really, really key, because at least they get in the discipline. You may or may not be using that data and it might not be important to your operations, but having them in that flow and part of your culture from the beginning is absolutely essential.
Yeah, it's a lot tougher to kind of steer the Titanic once it's out at sea versus when you're, docked at port, basically.
For sure. Great analogy.
Well, tell me a little bit, Deb, because one of the things I think will be interesting for the audience today is, as you and I connected offline, you mentioned that within your agency that time tracking guidelines, not following those is, essentially a fireable offense, for lack of a better term. It's taken that seriously. Why is that? And where do you think there are some misperceptions around time tracking before we get into really how you guys adopt a system that you are able to have your team adhere to and actually not hate at the same time?
Yes, it sounds terrible when you say it, like a fireable offense. And certainly we never want to fire anyone over time tracking, but it is something that's absolutely critical to our operations, to our business. So it's not a surprise to anyone that comes into Marketri that you have to track your time. It's one of the things we talk about on the very first interview, that we're a professional services company and that we do track our time. We realize folks that have never been in consulting probably haven't been exposed to that, and we want to make sure that it's okay and it's something they feel like they can adopt over time. Certainly we don't expect folks who have never done it before to, on their first day or second day, be a whiz bang at it, and we make sure that we provide the resources and the training right from day one to make sure that they have the information they need to do time tracking. And I will tell you that whole first week that we're onboarding a new employee, there are multiple check-ins during that week to make sure that they know how to track their time, they're finding the information okay, and also to make sure that they're doing it. Because if a couple of weeks go by and if they're not doing it, it goes back to sort of that culture that they don't have it instilled, that this is part of my role and I need to do this every day.
Yeah, it sounds like basically the way that you guys have gone about instilling time tracking into the agency goes back to your very first example. We don't want to try and steer the Titanic once it's out at sea, in this case with individuals. Even though you've kind of done with the agency, you're doing that with individuals in the hiring process, in the onboarding, in the training, well before they get a few weeks in and start taking on their first clients, right?
Absolutely, absolutely true. So I guess one of the other things, in terms of being a fireable offense, we have it in the employee handbook as far as the critical nature of time tracking. So folks do have that information on their first day. And as I shared, they do have training available. And what we usually say is like, the first time it's not done, we're going to sit down with you, we're going to talk about it, make sure you have the resources. The second time, one of the things that I find is really highly motivating is, we'll say the second time we're going to pay you for the time you tracked, in terms of your actual payroll. We're going to prorate it based on the time that you recorded. Usually that is a moment where it's like, oh, it's actually kind of related to how I get paid and, working a 40-hour week. And so that usually does the trick. We've never had to fire anybody because they didn't track their time. So happy to say that.
I think that is evidence that, the training process and the culture that you guys have built around time tracking is really working. And one of the things that I've heard you talk about before, Deb, that goes a little bit deeper than what most agencies talk about is explaining the why of time tracking. Every live stream that I've hosted with others or panelists or podcast episodes about time tracking within the agency starts with, well, you got to explain the why. And then we talk for a little bit about it, but we don't really go deep there. I love your framework for explaining actually 4 specific reasons. There's a little bit of alliteration to these 4 reasons, the 4 P's of why when it comes to time tracking. Tell us what those are, and then let's dig into each a little bit on how you explain them to your team.
So the 4 P's of time tracking really are, we get paid. The payment aspect of time tracking. Performance helps you monitor the performance of the company, of the clients, and the projects, and the professionals. It helps you monitor potential scope creep. And the final is it really does help with professional development for the team. So those are the 4 P's, and I'm happy to dig into each one of those. Starting with payment, I'm really happy to share in 19 years, we have never not gotten paid, which is probably a little bit of a luck. But also I do think it has to do with the rigor of time tracking and really being accountable for what the services are that you're providing to the client. There have been instances over time when a client's been curious as far as like maybe what we accomplish per the scope, because at Marketri we work on retainer, so we don't really work hourly. We just track our time hourly to back into scopes of work that we're committed to on an annual basis. And should a client ever have an interest in looking at that data, we have it at our fingertips. And again, most of our clients never do, but just in case they ever needed to, it's easy enough to pull that data, and I'm always happy to share it. So I fundamentally believe that it helps with ensuring that you're getting paid and you're providing the value as you've scoped it in your contracts.
Yeah, and it's really a common thread to what you were just talking about there with your employees. If you're saying right here in the handbook, right, like it's not immediately, but you do have a step there where if you're not tracking all your time, you're getting paid for the time that you're tracking, because that does connect with how we track things and get paid from our clients. Like there is a flow of money there, right? From the client to the agency to the employee, and helping them just see that, I think, is very helpful. So the other thing I wanted to call out that you mentioned there, Deb, is you guys don't work on an hourly basis. You don't bill your clients based on time. You bill on retainer, but you still track your time, and that's really important. I think that'll probably come up in the 3rd P as we talk about scope creep. Before we get there, talk about number 2. How does the 2nd P of time tracking, performance, explaining that why to your team members, what does that look like?
So I don't feel like people really make the connection between time tracking and operational performance of the business. And so one of the things I really do like to share with the entire team is how it sort of ladders up, how time tracking ladders up to the profitability of the company, the profitability of certain accounts, and the profitability of projects. And we track all of those things. So we actually bring all of our team members into monthly meetings where we actually look at the data that's pulled from time tracking. It's really separated by different client, by professional working on that client. And so when they're able to see, like we're scoped for, say, 100 hours of work for a particular client on retainer, they're able to see by professional for that client over the course of a month, how our hours added up and whether we were over or under scope. And we look at that cumulatively over the course of the contract. So, we don't sweat working a little extra for clients during certain months, or, sometimes, people will be on vacation, we might be a little under. What we really look is the cumulative, and having that flexibility. So I believe it's eye-opening when our professionals actually see that data and they're like, oh, I understand. I understand how our scopes of work are created and how the time tracking helps us fulfill those scopes. I think another thing is overall looking at the profitability. I share with our professionals that our number one expense in the business by far in professional services are people. And so when they track an hour of time, that's sort of an hour of cost in the business, and a cost that we allocate per client account or whatever project you're working on. So for our professionals, we also look at the profitability per account, and that really it looks at a couple of different things. One is how many hours did you work on a particular client during that month, but at what level was that work performed? Certainly performing 30 hours of work at a CMO level and a CMO rate versus an associate or an associate rate will have very different implications on the profitability of that account. And every one of our accounts actually has a target hourly rate that's specified in our contracts. And those are the rates that we try on sort of a weighted average to hit. And so when they see that data and they understand how that works, I think it's really much easier to get people to track their time, because they know it's not like a micromanagement tool, it's an operational and it's a business tool, and it helps us to make really smart decisions moving forward.
I'm glad that you touched on that, because I think the perception from a lot of folks in agency life is that time tracking really is a micromanagement tool. It's not something for, as you said, operational efficiency. And as we're talking about here, the second P and why you're explaining time tracking is so important with your team, it's performance. It's the company's performance. It's profitability on the client. It's also, how efficient you're being as an individual as well. Let's talk about number 3, helping you identify potential scope creep. I imagine probably just thinking over the last 3-4 weeks, you could probably recall at least one situation, Deb, where, hey, we're time tracking on this account, and based on what you see, you've identified there might be some scope creep. Has something like that come up recently, and how did that play out?
I don't think there is a marketing agency out there where that hasn't happened recently. It is just a nature of the business, right? Because I think everyone always wants to do the best job on the projects they're working on. And sometimes you'll spend a little bit more time than was originally allocated for that project. It could be also clients have different working styles, and some clients need a little bit more communication, or they need more rounds of revisions on certain things, and that might be different than what we scoped as well. So one of the things I love about Teamwork is the project budget that you can put as far as how is this project scoped? Is it scoped for 100 hours? And then it gives you a notification when you're 80% through that project. So if you get a notification that you're 80% through that project, but you've only actually billed 30% of that work, you know that there's probably a little bit of an issue, and that we're probably going to have to either, 1, make some adjustments in terms of how we're working on the project, 2, understand that we're probably not going to be as profitable in that project because we're going to go over scope, and that really rests more with us and our operations, and look to how we can improve that in the future. And I think the third thing, though, is, if the client is indeed asked for more as part of that scope than we originally put in the proposal, the time to have the conversation with the client is before the end of the project. One of the things, back to the payment piece that I really believe in is never surprising a client on an invoice. But usually if you sit down with a client and sort of lay out that the scope has changed and what they want is a little bit different, and go ahead and talk about how that might be a little bit of an increase in terms of the investment, typically they're okay with that, or they may say, you know what, I really don't need those things. We're going to go back to the original scope, and then you can rein it in. And so it's kind of like a really nice gut check along the way. So you don't want to get to the end of the project to realize that you've gone way over scope. And I think tools in teamwork like the project budget and setting notifications are really helpful, sort of alerts that you may want to take a look at that and figure out what to do.
So many great things there, Deb. Obviously, I love the way that you guys are using the platform in that way to monitor and flag your team for potential scope creep. Also, what you said there, I think, is such a common issue, but very easily solved. If we think about, when you go out to a restaurant and you say, oh, I'd like this side. What does the waiter always do if it's an upcharge? Hey, that's an upcharge for that side. It's a premium. It's, if you're going to go to loaded baked potato instead of fries, right? Why do they do that? Because they don't want you to be upset when they bring the bill, because then it allows you to say, yeah, I'm fine with $2 extra. Well, $4 extra, inflation for that, or to change your mind and say, you know what, actually, I'm good with fries. We're sticking to a budget. Give your client the chance to respond to you as kind of that server in that situation. Maybe I'm stretching an analogy, but I feel like it's such a common problem. We just need a picture in our mind to go to and to guide us in that sort of situation, right?
Absolutely. That is a perfect analogy, actually, because, all things being equal, everyone would want like the steak instead of the burger or the Dom Perignon as opposed to the Chardonnay. So I think that all of our clients sort of understand their scopes. We're really big as far as communication, and they're all like super reasonable people. So I think with diligent time tracking, you can avoid sticky situations, which, are never comfortable and actually can damage a client relationship over time. So, I think one of the things that I always share with the team is, we don't want to scope our clients to death. We don't always want to be bringing up scope. And a way to avoid that is to be monitoring the scope and to actively be looking at the time billed to the project and where you are and making sure you're tracking correctly. And if not, having conversations with your manager or other people in Marketri to really understand how to kind of course correct and get back on track.
Yeah, the earlier that you have that conversation, the better. And if you're looking at the data, the sooner you're going to be prompted to actually have that conversation. So we've been talking about, explaining to your team why time tracking is so important. And we've touched on 3 of the 4 so far, Deb. Payment, it's how you get paid, it's how we get paid. 2, it's how we track performance with our clients, which is very inextricably tied to scope creep, as we were just saying there, and I think you tied them together beautifully. To round it out, number 4, I think a lot of agency leaders have a missed opportunity here where they could explain the why of time tracking to their team that is selfishly very much for the team member, and that is their own personal and professional development. We're going to squeeze in 2 P's for the final one. Tell us a little bit about where you think agency leaders could lean into this and explaining it in a way that makes a ton of sense for their employees.
I think there are a number of ways to look at it that is actually really good for the professional. And I've had professionals share that with me. They've shared, like, I really didn't want to do it, but now that I'm doing it, it's really helpful for me to be able to go back and see how I spend my day, how I spend my weeks, and it helps shape how I operate and how efficient I am. I think it also identifies some training needs. Sometimes we can look across a professional and see when they work on a certain type of project, whether it could be a writing project or something involving technology, that they tend to run a little bit over scope on those projects. And, we never view that as like a bad thing. We look at it as, something that we need to recognize, and it's an opportunity to train that professional so that they can be more efficient moving forward. It's a win for them. It's a win for Marketri. And I think the proper time tracking really flags those issues. So that's definitely something. And I do think as well, when you include the professionals in the meetings where you're looking at the time and you're looking at the profitability and how all that ties together, and then you even take it a step further and you might bring it to your town hall and say, Marketri, for the last 3 months, on 20 of our accounts, we were on scope, we were profitable, we hit our average billing rates, and these are the numbers for the quarter. And look at our profit margins, and we hit our overall profit margins. And for our employees that have a 401k profit sharing plan, they know when they're hitting their profitability numbers that means good things for them at year end. So again, being able to ladder it up from tracking your time all the way to the overall company profitability and how that's going to impact every employee, I think is really meaningful. And I think it helps give them a bit of business acumen so they understand the business dynamics of Marketri and how they as individuals impact our bottom line, so to speak. And I've heard from a number of employees that they really appreciate learning more about the business of the agency, and that they really like being included in those discussions and having, knowing how they're shaping the outcomes at the end of the year.
Yeah, that is a great spot to kind of round out these 4 Ps as you explain the why of time tracking to your team. It's how we get paid, helps us monitor performance, potential scope creep, and it's personal development for you. Something you just said there, the business acumen has so many ripple effects, I think, when you and your team are aligned on this as a benefit. Because let's say they eventually want to go out on their own. They want to be a solopreneur or start another agency. What are those folks often terrible at? Determining what should I charge and how much time is it going to take me. If you say, hey, look, you're getting really good at tracking your time, knowing how much time is going to take you, managing scope. If you want to go out on your own, you're going to be well suited to do that. The other side of that is, hey, you want to stay and you want to continue to contribute within the agency and you want to grow into leadership, or you just want to be that rock star individual contributor. That business acumen is going to help you with that CMO, with that VP of marketing that you're serving, because you're able to level up the conversation beyond the deliverables and the work to have a conversation that you wouldn't be able to have without that business acumen. So kind of 2 different tangents of that same benefit, but I think that they are, 2 sides of the same coin.
Absolutely.
Well, Deb, you mentioned something there that you guys are very transparent about your profit sharing and how that is tied to profitability. Any advice for folks, don't have to share exactly percentages and the sorts of things that you guys do there, but anything that you're willing to share and able to share on how you guys structure that, and any tips for talking about that could be helpful for other agencies?
I think all business owners are a little bit different in terms of how much information they want to share with their employees, and I certainly respect, all different viewpoints on this, but over time, I found being as transparent as possible tends to make people feel really engaged and empowered to affect the business long term. So on our quarterly town halls, we go over our numbers for the quarter. We go over how we're tracking towards our goals for the year. And again, not just from a revenue standpoint, which I do think a lot of businesses focus a lot more on the top line than the bottom line, but both are critically important, as we know. So we do focus on the top line, but we focus as much on our profit margins. And because we are, again, a professional service business, the biggest cost in the business is the talent portion, and everyone here knows, how they play into that. So I think it's really important just to come full circle. If you're going to ask them to track time and they understand the why, I think it's only fair to give them sort of the results of their efforts. I mean, even if they might not be the results that we intended, we can troubleshoot and sort of look at what happened and why maybe our margins are a little bit off this quarter, or what happened. And we actually have sort of a list of profit margin busters that we go through so that everyone understands what makes profit margins go up and what makes profit margins go down.
What's on that list of profit margin busters? Yeah, I just have to pause there because I just love that name, by the way.
Yeah, so profit margin busters are scope creep, going over scopes on projects. Also, because we do work on retainer, there are certain things that are included in our retainers with our clients, and there are certain things that we scope outside of those retainers. And a profit margin buster would be including something that should have been outside the retainer, but somehow it was included in the retainer. Turnover, team turnover, that is a huge profit margin buster. There's lots of stats out there about, the disruption of, someone leaving the organization and hiring and bringing someone in. And it's also sort of a bummer for the team and it's a bummer for the clients. And so that to me is probably the biggest one that has the biggest impact. Client turnover is a profit margin buster. After you work with a client, most of our clients are with us 4, 5, 6 years. It becomes like this beautiful marriage. You know each other, you're in a rhythm, you know the people of their business, they know us, and it tends to be a really efficient relationship. And that first year you're working with the client, it's like the first year of marriage, you're kind of figuring things out. And so what we say is we want to keep our clients long term. The longer that we can keep clients, the better we can serve them. We understand how to serve them really well, and it becomes super efficient. So not having any client churn definitely is on that list as well.
I love how you guys have labeled that, and I think those all definitely make sense to me as well, Deb. Well, before we get into our final 2 segments on agency life, as we always do, Deb, I want to ask you a question. You have laid out some really great things here to instill a culture of time tracking that your team doesn't hate and is consistent, and you're able to maintain it. You talked about setting the stage early in your hiring process, well before your training and onboarding and doing reviews with your employees. We spent a good bit of time talking about explaining the why and not just saying, hey, because we have to, because we're professional services, but drilling into that in the 4 ways that we talked about, and then also connecting that to profit sharing in a way that makes sense for your business and being transparent about that. I think if folks are doing those 3 things, they're headed in a good direction. How could someone follow maybe all of those pieces of advice and still run into a pothole? What's maybe 1 or 2 of the potholes on the road that they should keep their eyes out for, where they're trying to follow this advice, but they could still run into some challenges if they don't keep their eyes out for something specific here, Deb?
Well, it's really easy to run into snafus with time tracking, and I definitely have run into them myself. So I would share, document your time tracking policy, have it documented, and spend time doing so. Put it in your employee handbook and make sure that it is really out there from day one when someone starts. Don't let a week go by or 2 weeks go by where someone is not tracking their time and tracking their time how the organization needs the time tracked. It just sort of establishes bad patterns from the start. And so that's probably the biggest, I would say, hiccup that you're going to have if it's not well documented, it's not part of your onboarding discussions, and you're not really paying attention the first couple weeks. If you say, oh, well, that person's new, so it's okay if they just code all their time to this bucket or that bucket, I wouldn't do that. I would actually tell them to spend, if they need to spend an hour and a half or 2 hours tracking their time because they're really unfamiliar with it, then that's what they need to do their first couple of weeks until they're in a groove and they know where to find the different projects and learn how to track their time how they want to. Give them that time, give them the training, and give them the policy.
I love it. That is a great way to sum it up. And it comes back to where we started the conversation, that it's tougher to change direction once you're out at sea versus when you're at port. Also reminds me of the phrase, we hear as parents that you can't really complain about what you're willing to tolerate. Oftentimes as parents, it's like, oh, I wish they would do that. Well, did we really coach them in the right way to not do that? Same thing as leaders here. So that makes a ton of sense, and I think it rounds it out really well. Well, Deb, we're going to hit you with our Fast Five, our rapid fire round here. Okay. And number 1 is, let's say someone gave you $10,000 a month for Marketri, no strings attached. How do you think you would use that extra infusion of capital into the business?
I would probably hire a full-time marketer for our own marketing. As a marketing agency, that may sound ridiculous, but we are so client-focused and all of our priorities are on the client that sometimes we tend not to do our own marketing or pay attention to our own marketing as well. So that's what I would do with that infusion account.
It is not ridiculous at all. We are, a dozen or more episodes into this show at this point, and that has been the answer the majority of the time. People in our own marketing are really the top 2. So it's interesting to see that trend, and I guess we can at least let you know that you're not alone there. All right, Deb, number 2, what is one of your all-time favorite business books that has impacted you as a marketing leader, an agency owner, or just in general in your agency life?
Yeah, I am a big fan of a book called Radical Candor. It is a leadership book, and it really talks about having very open and honest conversations with your direct reports, not letting things fester. It's really been a game changer for me because I think in general, no one really likes conflict. But I find that you actually build trust when you have those discussions, and you provide more learning opportunities for the employees as well. So highly recommend it.
Very good shout out. One of my favorite books, and a mantra from that book of just say it, lean into the conversation and ship the feedback quickly, is still stuck in my head from Kim Scott. So we're both a fan there. All right, Deb, number 3, what's one mistake you've made in running your agency that you will never forget?
I would say that during a very tight labor market, sort of right after COVID, when the Great Resignation was going on, it was a very, very tight labor market, and we were growing and we had needs, and made some hires that probably I didn't feel 100% about in terms of just the perfect fit for Marketri, and it didn't work out with a couple of folks, and it really was kind of devastating because I don't like to have that impact on them, our people, our clients. And so, the lesson learned is just absolutely make sure it's the right fit. Tight labor market or not tight labor market, you just need to find people that are going to fit like a glove in your organization.
Really good call out. And that's been one that has been repeated with that question of making the wrong hire or making a wrong hire too quickly or onboarding too quickly. So you're not alone there. I think it's something that a lot of marketing agency owners are trying to figure out and learn from, obviously. All right, we're going to round it out with 4 and 5, which are my favorite. Deb, number 4, what's the hardest part about agency life in your opinion?
Capacity planning and just overall making sure there's buffer in folks' schedules so that they have time to be creative and take a breath.
That is definitely a common one for sure. All right, number 5, we're going to end on a positive note. Deb, what's your favorite part about agency life?
Oh, the collaboration with like-minded professionals. I love ideating about marketing and sharing ideas and really trying to bring our best practices to clients. So that is 1,000% my favorite part about the business.
I love it. 1,000%. No hesitation on number 5 from you. Very good stuff. All right, Deb. Well, we want to continue to build this community of agency owners and leaders who are sharing with their peers. And so one way we want to do that is give a shout out to those who have impacted our agency life. Who do you want to call out today that has been instrumental at some point or throughout your career and your journey through agency life?
I would love to shout out to my financial advisor, Rob Stevenson of Rockwood Wealth Advisory. He has been instrumental in really helping me shape sort of my financial health through having my own business. He was instrumental in putting together our 401k profit sharing plan, helping us through COVID and the Paycheck Protection Program. I could go on, but he has been just a lifeline for me in the business, and I just don't know what I would do without him. So Rob Stevenson, you're the best.
I love it, Rob. I hope you're enjoying that shout out and you're listening. And for other agency owners who are thinking about, maybe Deb, the advice that you gave about connecting time tracking to profit sharing and profitability, he may be someone that they want to reach out to. And on that note of connection, Deb, I want to make sure for our listeners today who want to connect with you as a peer to be able to reach out to you if they want to connect, ask some follow-up questions about what you shared today. Obviously, time tracking is a hot button issue for agency owners all the time. What's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. You can go to my website, fill out a contact form, or you could just email me at dandrews@marketri.com. I'd be happy and welcome to have discussions with fellow agency owners.
Well, I appreciate your transparency on that. And I'm sure any of those follow-up conversations that happen will be as great as this one today. So thank you for your time and being our guest on Agency Life, Deb.
My pleasure, Logan. Thanks for having me.